Jake had always been obsessed with photography. It was his way of capturing the world, of making it stand still. But that was before the camera, before everything changed. One gray afternoon, while wandering through a crowded flea market, he stumbled upon a dusty table filled with old cameras. Most were broken or rusted, but one caught his eye, a vintage Polaroid, its black casing worn with time. It felt heavy in his hands, almost too heavy. Behind the table sat an old man, his face lined with deep wrinkles, his fingers twitching as he reached for the camera. His voice was low, raspy. "That one's not for sale," he muttered. Jake chuckled. "Come on, man, everything's got a price." The old man hesitated, then sighed. He tapped a bony finger on the camera's surface. "Never take a picture of yourself. Never take a picture at night. And whatever you do, don't look at the last photo." Jake smirked. It was obviously some weird sales gimmick. He handed over the money and took the camera home. That night, curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed the Polaroid, loaded it with fresh film, and stepped outside. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few late-night stragglers. He snapped a picture of a man sitting alone on a bench. The Polaroid slid out with a mechanical whir, slowly developing before his eyes. But something was off. Behind the man, in the shadows, stood a tall, blurry figure. Its face was featureless, its body stretched unnaturally. Jake blinked. The bench had been empty except for the man. Had he just not noticed someone there? Shrugging it off, he took another photo, this time of a young woman waiting at a bus stop. The photo developed. And there it was again, the same shadowy figure. Closer. A chill crept down his spine. The next morning, Jake returned to the coffee shop where he had taken the first picture. The barista was talking to a police officer, a missing person report. The man from the bench had vanished. No witnesses, no leads. Jake's stomach twisted. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But then he checked the news later that evening. The young woman at the bus stop, also missing. His hands shook as he pulled out the photos again. The shadowy figure was in every single one, and it was getting closer in each picture. He needed to test something. That night, he set the camera on a tripod in his apartment and took a picture of his own living room. As the Polaroid developed, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the corner of the room, stood the figure. His blood ran cold. The room was empty. He was alone, or so he had thought. Heart pounding, he checked every closet, every dark corner. Nothing. But when he looked back at the photo, the figure was closer now. Desperate, Jake decided to destroy the camera. He smashed it against the counter. Nothing. He tried burning it, but the flames wouldn't touch it. Then, in his panic, he noticed something he hadn't before. At the bottom of the last developed picture, in faint, scratched handwriting, were the words, "Look behind you." Jake froze. A click. His phone had just taken a picture, on its own. His hands trembled as he opened his gallery. The newest photo made his stomach drop. It was a picture of himself, sitting on the couch. Behind him, right over his shoulder. The figure was smiling. Jake bolted from the apartment, heart racing. He ran into the streets, gasping for air. He needed to get rid of it. He had to get rid of it. But it was too late. The last picture taken by the Polaroid began developing. Even though no one had pressed the shutter, slowly, the image formed. Jake, standing in the street, staring at the camera. Behind him, the figure loomed, no longer blurred, no longer a shadow. It had a face now, and it looked just like him. The next morning, the apartment was empty. Jake was gone. The only thing left was the Polaroid camera, sitting on the counter. The film was still warm. Somewhere, in another city, at another flea market, An old man placed the camera back on his table, and he waited for the next buyer, waited for someone to take the next picture, someone who wouldn't listen, someone who would smile back. The night was suffocatingly quiet at the Crestview Hotel. It wasn't that Mark minded the late-night shifts. He was used to the silence. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the strange weight in the air, or the faint hum of the old pipes. But the hotel had always had an oppressive, otherworldly vibe. Mark sat behind the front desk, his gaze drifting to the clock. The time barely moved, as if it too was stuck in this endless night. The grand chandelier above him swung slightly in the draft, casting long, distorted shadows on the marble floor. The lobby was still, empty except for the faded velvet armchairs and long corridors leading to rooms that had been abandoned for weeks. He glanced out the front windows. No cars passed by. It was a ghost town. But then, the door opened. A man stepped in. A guest, tall, slender, and dressed in a sharp black suit. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes, sunken and hollow, glinted with something unsettling. He didn't speak at first. The air seemed to grow heavier as the man moved toward the desk. Mark forced a polite smile. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" The man's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "I have a reservation," he said in a low, gravelly voice. Mark searched the computer, his fingers tapping keys. The hotel was nearly empty. It wasn't hard to find the man's name. But when he read it, he paused. There was no reservation. Mark looked up at the guest. "Sorry, sir. There seems to be some mistake. I don't see your name in the system." The man smiled wider. "I'm sure you do." Mark swallowed. "I'm afraid I can't check you in without a reservation." For a moment, the man simply stared at him. The air between them thickened, charged with something Mark couldn't place. He started to feel dizzy, as if the walls were closing in. Then the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single key. It was an old-fashioned brass key with the number 1313 etched into it. "Room 1313, the man said softly. His smile grew. "I'll be staying for the night." Mark handed the man the brass key with room number 1313 etched into it, still unsure of what was happening. The man's pale fingers curled around the key, his smile never faltering, not even for a moment. The air between them grew thick, charged with a strange energy that Mark couldn't place. Something felt off. "Thank you," the man said in that low, gravelly voice. But when he spoke, Mark noticed something. There was no echo of breath. The voice came through perfectly, like it was being transmitted from somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't belong in this world. Mark cleared his throat. "The elevator is just around the corner," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "But if you need anything, just call." The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the elevator, his long, thin figure slipping into the dim hallway. Mark watched him for a few moments, his instincts telling him to watch, to stay alert. But he felt frozen, an uncomfortable knot tightening in his chest. There was something about the way the guest moved. It was too smooth, like he wasn't entirely human. The way his feet barely seemed to touch the ground as he walked, the fluidity of his motion that made his figure almost seem to glide. Mark swallowed. It didn't feel like a normal hotel interaction. Everything about this guest felt out of place, as though he had come from a place far darker than just a room on the 5th floor. The elevator doors opened with a low creak, and Mark found himself staring at the guest's reflection in the elevator's brass doors. But as the guest stepped inside, the doors didn't close immediately. They lingered. Mark blinked. He hadn't pressed the button. The elevator should have been on its way up already. But the doors didn't shut. The guest stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead, his smile still there, stretched unnaturally across his face. Mark felt a bead of sweat run down his back. He took a step closer, instinctively, and reached out. He was about to ask if the man was okay, but something stopped him. Something in the guest's stillness, in his unnerving silence. Then, just as Mark was about to open his mouth, the elevator door slammed shut. Mark stumbled back, feeling his heart skip a beat. He let out a slow breath, telling himself it was nothing, just a weird guy, nothing more. The elevator was probably just on a delay. He turned away, trying to shake the feeling of unease crawling up his spine. But then the hair on the back of his neck stood up. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper lingered in the air, like the faintest breeze that carried a voice with it. "You'll be next." Mark's blood ran cold. He spun toward the elevator, but it was already gone, taking the guest to the unknown floor, to room 1313. His pulse quickened. He knew he should leave, walk out the front door. But for some reason, his feet were glued to the ground, and he couldn't tear himself away from the lobby. He stared at the elevator, waiting for it to return, but it never did. The unsettling silence of the hotel wrapped around him like a thick, suffocating fog. Mark stood in the lobby, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as his mind raced. He had just spoken to the guest in room 1313, yet the strange encounter still lingered in his mind like a cold, gnawing sensation. There was something so off about that man, something that didn't sit right. The air in the hotel seemed to have thickened, pressing down on him with every breath he took. His skin prickled, as if he wasn't alone, as if a presence was watching him. He forced himself to look away from the elevator and focus on the task at hand. But the hotel felt different now. The silence was too complete. It had always been quiet here at night, but tonight it was more than that. The hum of the old pipes seemed louder. The creaking of the floorboards seemed deeper, as though something beneath the building was stirring. Mark's gaze drifted toward the hallway that led to the back of the hotel. The dim lights flickered, casting long, sharp shadows along the walls. He could feel the weight of those shadows, like they were reaching for him. The once familiar hallways now felt foreign, disorienting. A faint whisper brushed his ears. He froze, heart hammering in his chest. It was so soft, so subtle, that he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, close enough that it seemed to be right behind him. "Mark!" His breath caught in his throat, and he turned quickly. But there was no one there, no one in the lobby, no sign of anyone moving down the hall. Just the stillness. A sharp creak echoed through the floor, coming from behind him. He whipped around, but again, nothing. No movement, no sound, except for the groan of the old building. Something was wrong. His mind raced. It was just the nerves, he told himself, just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the feeling wouldn't leave. Then, another sound, a dragging noise, slow and deliberate. It came from the far end of the hallway. Not a footstep, more like something being pulled, like the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The noise grew closer, inching toward him. Mark felt his chest tighten. Who else could it be? There was no one in the building at this hour, right? Just a handful of guests. The man in room 1313 had already gone upstairs. Or so Mark thought. A flicker of movement in the hallway caught his eye. He squinted, straining to see, but the hallway was still dark, the lights overhead flickering again. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper, as though something was slipping just out of view. "Mark!" The voice was close now. He could feel it, like it was behind his ear. But he was alone. The lobby was empty. His breath quickened. His hands shook. The elevator doors, which had been silent and closed for what felt like an eternity, suddenly dinged. Mark spun toward them, his heart thundering in his chest. The elevator door slid open, but no one stepped out. The dim light inside cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls. For a moment, Mark stood there frozen, staring at the empty, waiting elevator. He could hear the dragging sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the elevator. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and the oppressive air in the lobby became suffocating. No one is there, Mark muttered under his breath, trying to steady his nerves. He forced himself to move toward the elevator, feeling a strange pull toward it. He had to know. He stepped closer, his shoes squeaking faintly on the tile floor. The drag continued, slower now, as if the source was moving closer. His hand hovered near the closed elevator doors, but he couldn't bring himself to open them. Then, the whispering came again. Mark, ... His stomach twisted. He couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, he stepped back from the elevator and moved quickly to the nearest hallway, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He needed to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing. He stood there, his heartbeat loud in his ears, as the dragging sound grew fainter. Just as Mark thought he could breathe again, a soft sound caught his attention. A faint click. It came from the back of the hotel, the very back. A door that was rarely used, an old storage room. The door, which Mark was certain had been locked before, was now slightly ajar. Mark felt the air in his lungs tighten. He needed to investigate. He had to know what was going on. But just as he turned to walk toward it, the lights above him flickered violently, the whole lobby plunging into darkness. A moment later, the lights came back on, but this time, the hallway was empty. The dragging sound had stopped. The elevator was silent, and the door at the end of the hall was wide open. Mark's pulse raced. He turned and ran toward the stairs, wanting to get out of the hall, away from whatever was happening. He could hear the footsteps following him, but they were too slow, too deliberate. Reaching the stairs, Mark took them two at a time, finally bursting out into the lobby. He grabbed the phone behind the desk, intending to call the police, but the phone line was dead. Static crackled in the receiver, but nothing more. Suddenly, the elevator bell rang. Mark didn't dare turn around. He could feel the air shift. Something was standing behind him. He didn't want to look, but he had to. He slowly turned his head, and there, standing in the lobby, was the guest. His smile was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. His eyes were black, hollow, and gleamed in the dim light. He didn't say a word. He just stared. Mark's legs went weak. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Whoa, what do you want from me?" he managed to whisper. The guest took a step closer, his movements smooth, unnatural. "I've been here longer than you think, Mark." His voice was different now. It wasn't the low, gravelly tone from before. It was something else, something that scraped against Mark's very soul. "I've been waiting," the guest hissed, "for the last guest." Before Mark could react, the lights in the lobby flickered. The room seemed to stretch and twist around him, his vision blurred. Suddenly, Mark was no longer in the hotel. The surroundings were wrong. It felt like the walls were closing in and he couldn't breathe. The guest was still there, but his face was different now, more distorted. The guest took another step, and Mark could feel a cold breeze on the back of his neck. "You are the last guest," the guest whispered, his face splitting into a horrific grin. "This hotel is my home now, and soon it will be yours." The lights flickered one last time before everything went dark. The next morning, The hotel staff found the lobby exactly as it had been, still untouched. The bellhop was gone. The phone was still dead. And when they checked room 1313, it was locked. And when they opened the door, the room was empty. Not a single trace of the bellhop remained, but the key, 1313, was still lying on the desk. It was almost midnight when Sarah, exhausted from a long day, sat down to relax. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, the light flickering in the darkness. She reached for it absent-mindedly, swiping across the screen. The message was from an unknown number. Just one line. "I know what you did last summer." Her heart skipped a beat. She frowned. It must be a prank. She stared at the message, a chill creeping up her spine. Her mind raced. But how did they know? Sarah typed back, her fingers trembling. "Who is this?" A few seconds passed. The screen flickered again. The reply came almost instantly. "Don't you remember?" "You tried to forget." She sat up, eyes wide. A flood of memories hit her like a wave. That summer, the night she and her friends had gotten into a terrible accident. They never spoke of it again. They swore to keep it a secret. But what if someone else knew? A cold sweat dripped down her back. She looked around the empty room. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. She hesitated, then opened it. "You should have listened." Her hands shook as she dropped the phone. The screen went black. Suddenly, the light flickered. And then, a voice. "Sarah." She froze. The voice. It sounded like one of her old friends from that night. Her eyes darted toward the door. Nothing. But then, the phone vibrates again. She picked up the phone, but this time, it wasn't a message. It was a video. Her hands felt cold as she pressed play. The screen showed a dark, wooded area. The camera jerked around, showing the trees, the headlights of a car. Then a flash. There, in the distance, was Sarah. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood beside her. A figure with a dark hoodie, barely visible in the shadows. They whispered something in her ear, but Sarah couldn't hear it clearly. Suddenly, the figure turned toward the camera, and the phone screen went black again. A knock. It was soft at first, then louder. A pounding at the door. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the door, her eyes fixed on it. Her phone fell from her hands, slipping onto the floor. The knocking continued, louder now, more desperate. Then, a voice. "Sarah, open the door. I know what you did." Her stomach dropped. She scrambled backward, but when she looked up, there, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the video, the hooded figure, and they weren't alone.